The dust swirled around Margaret's worn boots as she stood on the auction block, her hands trembling despite the defiant tilt of her chin. The harsh Wyoming sun beat down mercilessly on the crowd of rough men gathered below, their eyes calculating her worth like they might assess a horse or a head of cattle. At 26, she had already lived through more heartbreak than most women twice her age, and now she faced the ultimate humiliation of being sold to the highest bidder because her womb had failed to bear children. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the dusty town square, his words cutting through her like a rusty blade. Here we have Margaret Sullivan, good with cooking and cleaning, strong as an ox, but mind you, gentlemen, she's proven barren after 3 years of marriage. Starting bid at $50. The crowd murmured, some shaking their heads and walking away. In 1887, a woman's value was measured by her ability to produce heirs, and Margaret had been found wanting. She closed her eyes and remembered happier times, when she first arrived in Cheyenne as a young bride full of hope and dreams. Her husband Thomas had been kind at first, but as the months turned to years without the patter of little feet in their modest home, his kindness had curdled into resentment. When the doctor finally declared her condition permanent, Thomas had wasted no time in filing for divorce and putting her up for auction to recoup his losses, as was his legal right under territorial law. The bidding was lackluster, with only a few half-hearted offers from men looking for cheap labor rather than a wife. Margaret's heart sank as she realized she might end up in one of the mining camps, working herself to death in conditions that would make a mule weep. Just when the auctioneer was about to bring down his gavel at $65, a deep voice rang out from the back of the crowd. $100. The voice belonged to a tall man with broad shoulders and calloused hands, his face weathered by years of hard work under the open sky. He wore simple clothes, a flannel shirt and worn denim pants, but there was something in his steady gaze that made Margaret's breath catch. Unlike the other men who had looked at her with calculating eyes, this stranger's expression held only kindness and perhaps a touch of sadness that mirrored her own. The auctioneer's eyes lit up at the unexpected windfall. $100 to the gentleman in back. Going once, going twice, sold. The gavel came down with finality, sealing Margaret's fate. As the crowd dispersed, the tall stranger approached the platform where she waited, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Mom, I'm Ezra Thornton," he said, removing his worn hat to reveal dark hair streaked with premature gray. "I own a timber operation up in Pine Ridge, about 2 days' ride north of here. I want you to know that I'm not looking for a servant or someone to take advantage of. I have 4 children who lost their mother 2 years ago, and they need someone who can give them the love and care they deserve." Margaret studied his face, searching for any sign of deception or cruelty, but found only earnest honesty. "Mr. Thornton, I should tell you that I cannot give you children of your own." The doctor was quite clear about that. Ezra's expression softened, and he placed his hat back on his head. "Mom, I already have all the children I need. What they lack is a mother's love, and from what I can see in your eyes, you have plenty of that to give. The question is, are you willing to take on 4 young ones who have forgotten what it means to have someone who truly cares about them?" Tears pricked at Margaret's eyes, the first genuine offer of kindness she had received in months. She nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. Ezra helped her down from the platform with gentle hands, and within an hour they were riding north in his sturdy wagon, her few possessions tucked safely in the back. The journey to Pine Ridge took them through some of the most beautiful country Margaret had ever seen. Rolling hills covered in prairie grass gave way to dense forests of pine and aspen, their branches reaching toward a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Ezra proved to be a thoughtful traveling companion, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of the land without pressuring her to talk about her own painful past. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew crisp and clean, scented with pine needles and wildflowers. Margaret felt something inside her chest begin to loosen for the first time in years. When they finally crested a ridge, and she saw the valley spread out below them, dotted with tall timber and crossed by a crystal-clear stream, she understood why Ezra had chosen to make his home in this remote paradise. The house was larger than she had expected, built from the same pine logs that Ezra harvested from the surrounding forest. Smoke curled from the chimney, and she could see a vegetable garden that had been well tended but was now showing signs of neglect. As the wagon rolled to a stop in front of the porch, 4 faces appeared at the windows, eyes wide with curiosity and something that might have been hope. Ezra helped her down from the wagon seat, his hands strong and sure. "Children, come out here and meet Miss Margaret," he called, his voice gentle but firm. The front door opened slowly, and 4 young souls emerged like cautious deer stepping into a clearing. The oldest was a girl of perhaps 12, with dark hair braided down her back and eyes that held too much responsibility for her young age. Behind her came twin boys who looked to be about 8, their faces smudged with dirt and their clothes bearing evidence of their attempts at self-care. The youngest was a little girl of maybe 5, clutching a worn rag doll and peering at Margaret from behind her sister's skirts. "This is Sarah," Ezra said, placing a protective hand on the older girl's shoulder. "She's been doing her best to keep everyone together, but it's been hard on her. These are the twins, Matthew and Mark, and our little one here is Emma." His voice softened as he spoke their names, and Margaret could hear the love and concern that filled every syllable. Sarah stepped forward with the dignity of someone far older than her years. "Mom, are you going to be staying with us?" The question was simple, but Margaret could hear the weight of previous disappointments behind it. She had learned not to hope too hard for things that might not last. Margaret knelt down so she was at eye level with the children, her heart already expanding to make room for these 4 lost souls. "If your father will have me, and if you children think you might like having me around, then yes, I'd very much like to stay." She looked at each of them in turn, trying to memorize their faces and the way they stood together, protecting each other against a world that had already taken so much from them. Emma, the youngest, took a tentative step forward. "Are you going to be our new mama?" she asked in a voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air like morning mist, fragile and full of possibility. Margaret felt tears sting her eyes, but she smiled through them. "I would be honored to be your mama, if that's what you'd like. I promise I'll do my best to take care of all of you, and love you as much as any mother could." The transformation that came over the children was like watching flowers bloom after a long winter. Emma ran straight into Margaret's arms, her rag doll forgotten as she buried her face against Margaret's shoulder. The twins looked at each other and grinned, their faces lighting up with the first real joy they had shown. Even Sarah, who had been carrying the weight of the world on her young shoulders, allowed herself a small smile of relief. That first night, Margaret threw herself into the task of creating a proper home for her new family. The house had been clean but lacked the warm touches that made a place feel alive. She cooked a hearty dinner of venison stew and fresh biscuits, marveling at how the children's eyes grew wide at the sight of a proper meal served on clean plates with real napkins. As they sat around the large wooden table that Ezra had built with his own hands, Margaret listened to the gentle chatter of children who were finally beginning to feel safe again. Sarah told her about the lessons she had been teaching the younger ones, trying her best to make sure they didn't fall too far behind in their education. The twins shared stories of their adventures in the forest, building forts and tracking animals. Emma showed off her rag doll, introducing Margaret to each of its imaginary friends. Ezra watched it all with quiet satisfaction, his eyes soft as he observed his children coming back to life under Margaret's gentle care. When the meal was finished and the children had been tucked into their beds with stories and kisses, he and Margaret sat on the front porch listening to the night sounds of the forest. "I want you to know," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp mountain air, "that I don't expect anything from you that you're not ready to give. This is your home now for as long as you want it to be, and these children already think the world of you." Margaret looked out at the stars scattered across the dark sky like diamonds on black velvet. "Mr. Thornton, I've spent the last few years feeling like I was broken, like I had failed at the most basic thing a woman is supposed to do. But watching your children tonight, seeing how they've survived such loss and still have so much love to give, I realized that maybe I was looking at it all wrong." She turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "Maybe it wasn't a punishment that I couldn't have children. Maybe somewhere out there were 4 children who needed a mother, and my love was being saved for them." The weeks that followed were some of the happiest Margaret had ever known. She threw herself into her new role with the passion of someone who had finally found her true calling. She taught the children proper lessons in the morning, using books that Ezra had ordered from back east. In the afternoons, they would explore the forest together, learning about the plants and animals that made their home in the mountains. Sarah, who had been forced to grow up too fast, slowly began to act like a child again. She would giggle at Margaret's stories and beg for extra time before bed, reveling in the luxury of being cared for instead of always being the caretaker. The twins flourished under the structured routine, their natural energy channeled into useful work around the property and creative play that helped develop their minds. Little Emma blossomed like a flower in spring sunshine. She followed Margaret everywhere, chattering constantly about everything and nothing, making up elaborate stories about her doll and the adventures they would have together. At night, she would curl up in Margaret's lap while the older woman read stories or sang lullabies that her own mother had sung to her long ago. Ezra proved to be a thoughtful and gentle man, someone who had been shaped by loss but not hardened by it. He worked hard during the day, cutting timber and managing his small but successful operation, but he always made time for his children in the evenings. Margaret watched him with growing admiration as he helped with homework, settled disputes with wisdom and patience, and showed each child that they were valued and loved. As autumn painted the mountains in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Margaret realized that she had found something she had never even known she was looking for. She had a family, a real family, bound together not by blood but by choice and love and the daily acts of caring that built trust over time. The first real test of their new family structure came when winter settled over Pine Ridge like a thick white blanket. The isolation was complete, with snow blocking the mountain passes and keeping them cut off from the outside world for months at a time. Margaret had worried that being trapped together in the house might strain their relationships, but instead it seemed to draw them closer together. They developed routines and traditions that made the long winter months feel cozy rather than confining. Margaret taught the children to bake bread and cookies, filling the house with warm scents that spoke of home and comfort. Ezra carved wooden toys and taught the boys how to work with their hands, passing down skills that had been in his family for generations. In the evenings, they would gather around the fireplace. The children sprawled on a thick rug that Margaret had woven from scraps of fabric. She would read to them from adventure stories and fairy tales, her voice bringing distant lands and magical creatures to life in their mountain hideaway. Sarah proved to have a talent for drawing, sketching portraits of the family and scenes from the stories that captured both their likeness and their spirits. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Emma, now completely comfortable in her new life, made an announcement that stopped Margaret's heart. "Mama Margaret," she said, looking up from where she was playing with her doll. "When the snow melts, can we have a real wedding? Sarah says that people who love each other should get married, and you and Papa love each other, don't you?" The room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire. Margaret felt her cheeks burn as she realized that the child had seen something that she herself had been trying not to acknowledge. Somewhere along the way, her gratitude and affection for Ezra had deepened into something much stronger and more lasting. She glanced at Ezra and saw her own feelings reflected in his eyes. He had fallen in love with her gentle strength, her capacity for nurturing, and the way she had brought his broken family back to wholeness. She had fallen in love with his quiet integrity, his devotion to his children, and the way he had given her a chance to be the woman she was meant to be. "Emma," Ezra said softly, setting down the wooden horse he had been carving for Matthew. "That's something that Mama Margaret and I would need to talk about privately. But I want you to know that I think she's the most wonderful woman in the world, and I'm grateful every day that she chose to make a home with us." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes at the tenderness in his voice. "And I want all of you to know that I love each of you more than I ever thought it was possible to love anyone. You've given me a family and a purpose and a joy that I never expected to find." Later that night, after the children had been tucked into bed, Margaret and Ezra walked out onto the porch despite the bitter cold. The snow crunched under their feet, and their breath made clouds in the frigid air, but neither of them seemed to notice the temperature. "Margaret," Ezra began, his voice uncertain in a way she had never heard before, "I don't want you to feel pressured by what Emma said tonight. You've already given us so much, and I don't want you to think that I expect anything more from you." She turned to face him, her heart hammering in her chest. "Ezra, what if I told you that I wanted more? What if I told you that somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking of this as just an arrangement for the children's sake, and started thinking of it as a real family. What if I told you that I've fallen in love with you, with all of you, and that the thought of spending the rest of my life here in these mountains with you makes me happier than I ever dreamed possible? His answer was to pull her into his arms, holding her against his chest as if she might disappear like morning mist. Then I would tell you that I love you too, Margaret Sullivan, and that I can't imagine my life without you in it. I would tell you that you've brought light back into this house and hope back into my heart, and that I want to spend every day for the rest of my life showing you how grateful I am that you chose us. When spring finally broke winter's grip on the mountains, the whole valley seemed to celebrate with an explosion of wildflowers and new growth. The children were beside themselves with excitement as they planned the wedding, turning it into a family project that involved everyone from 5-year-old Emma to 12-year-old Sarah. The ceremony was simple but perfect, performed by a traveling preacher who made his way up to Pine Ridge, just as the last of the snow was melting from the high peaks. Margaret wore a dress that Sarah had helped her sew from blue fabric that matched her eyes, and Ezra wore his best suit with a wildflower boutonniere that Emma had insisted on making for him. The children stood as their witnesses, their faces glowing with happiness as they watched their parents exchange vows that promised love, honor, and cherishing for all their days to come. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the children cheered as if their favorite team had won the most important game in the world. As the years passed, the Thornton family became a cornerstone of the small community that grew up around Pine Ridge. Margaret's reputation as a teacher and healer spread throughout the valley, and she found herself caring for neighbor children who had no school to attend and tending to injuries and illnesses with the herbal remedies she had learned from the local tribal women. Sarah grew into a beautiful and intelligent young woman who eventually became a teacher herself, carrying on Margaret's legacy of education and compassion. The twins developed into strong, capable men who took over more and more of the timber operation as Ezra aged, their father's integrity and work ethic evident in everything they did. Emma remained the heart of the family, her joy and laughter brightening even the darkest days. Through it all, Margaret never stopped marveling at the unexpected turns her life had taken. The woman who had been declared worthless because she couldn't bear children had become the mother of 4 remarkable human beings, the wife of a man who loved her unconditionally, and the heart of a community that depended on her strength and wisdom. On quiet evenings, when the children were grown and busy with families of their own, Margaret and Ezra would sit on their front porch and watch the sun set behind the mountain peaks. They would hold hands like young sweethearts, their love deepened and strengthened by decades of shared joys and sorrows, triumphs and challenges. "Do you ever wonder?" Margaret asked one such evening, her hair now silver but her eyes still bright with the curiosity and warmth that had first attracted him. "What would have happened if you hadn't been at that auction that day?" Ezra squeezed her hand gently, his own face lined with years of laughter and sun and the occasional worry that came with raising children. "I try not to think about it," he admitted, "because I can't imagine a world where we didn't find each other. Those children needed you, Margaret, but I think maybe you needed them just as much." She smiled, thinking of their grandchildren playing in the yard where their own children had once built forts and caught fireflies. "You know, I spent so many years thinking I was broken because I couldn't have babies. But now I understand. Maybe I wasn't meant to create new life from my body. Maybe I was meant to breathe new life into hearts that had been broken, to show love to children who had forgotten what it felt like to be cherished." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had been sold like property, discarded as worthless, and written off as a failure. But in the loving hands of a lonely lumberjack and his 4 precious children, she had discovered that her worth was not measured by her ability to conceive, but by her capacity to love, to nurture, to heal, and to build something beautiful from the broken pieces of their lives. The woman who had once stood on an auction block in shame had become the beloved matriarch of a family that would carry her legacy of love forward for generations to come. In the end, she had proven that the greatest gift a woman can give is not life itself, but the love that makes life worth living. Years later, when traveling merchants would pass through Pine Ridge and hear the story of the Thornton family, they would shake their heads in wonder at how a woman once deemed worthless had become the most treasured person in the entire valley. children who had never known hunger because Margaret had taught their mothers to preserve food through harsh winters. Men who had learned to read because she had insisted that education was not a luxury but a necessity. Women who had survived difficult births because she had been there with steady hands and a calm voice, guiding new life into the world with the same gentleness she had shown her own children. Margaret's influence extended far beyond her immediate family. She had established the first school in Pine Ridge, teaching not just reading and arithmetic, but also practical skills that would serve the children well in their frontier lives. She showed the girls how to tend gardens and preserve food, how to sew and mend and create beauty even in the harshest circumstances. She taught the boys alongside the girls, believing firmly that knowledge belonged to everyone regardless of their gender. The local Native American tribes, initially wary of the growing settlement, came to respect and trust Margaret after she helped nurse several of their children through a particularly severe outbreak of influenza. She learned their language and their healing methods, creating a bridge between two worlds that might otherwise have remained forever divided. Chief Running Bear once told Ezra that his wife had the spirit of a true healer, one who saw no difference between the pain of a white child and that of a red child. When the railroad finally reached their part of Wyoming, bringing with it the promise of easier contact with the outside world, Margaret was instrumental in ensuring that Pine Ridge maintained its character and values even as it grew. She worked with Ezra and other community leaders to establish fair trading practices, to protect the natural beauty of their valley, and to ensure that newcomers understood they were joining a community built on mutual respect and cooperation rather than exploitation and competition. The children she had raised became leaders in their own right. Sarah opened a school for girls in Denver, determined to provide young women with opportunities that had been denied to previous generations. She never married, claiming that her students were all the children she needed. But those who knew her understood that she had learned from Margaret that love comes in many forms, and that a woman's worth is not measured by traditional expectations. Matthew and Mark took over the timber operation when Ezra's arthritis made the physical work too difficult. But they ran it according to the principles their parents had taught them. They harvested trees sustainably, replanted what they cut, and treated their workers fairly. Their lumber became sought after throughout the territory, not just for its quality, but because buyers knew it came from men who could be trusted to keep their word. Emma, the little girl who had once asked for a real wedding, grew up to become a doctor, one of the first women physicians in Wyoming territory. She had been inspired by watching Margaret care for the sick and injured, and she dedicated her life to bringing modern medical knowledge to frontier communities that desperately needed it. She established clinics throughout the region, training local women to provide basic medical care in areas too remote for regular doctor visits. But perhaps Margaret's greatest legacy was the way she had changed how the people of Pine Ridge thought about family and worth. In a society that often discarded those who didn't fit conventional molds, she had shown that broken things could be made beautiful, that different didn't mean lesser, and that love was not a finite resource that had to be rationed, but an infinite wellspring that grew stronger with sharing. The auction block where Margaret had once stood in humiliation was eventually torn down as Cheyenne grew and modernized, but the story of what had happened there lived on. Traveling preachers would sometimes tell the tale as an example of how beauty could rise from ashes, how what the world saw as failure could become something extraordinary. Young women facing their own struggles would find hope in Margaret's story, understanding that their worth was not determined by society's narrow definitions, but by the love they were capable of giving and receiving. When Margaret was 75 years old, she received an unexpected visitor. A young woman with familiar features stood on her front porch, her hands shaking with nervousness. She introduced herself as Catherine, the daughter of Thomas Sullivan, Margaret's first husband. She had traveled all the way from California to meet the woman her father had spoken of in his final days with such regret and sorrow. "He told me," Catherine said, her voice barely above a whisper, "that letting you go was the biggest mistake of his life. He said he had been so focused on what you couldn't give him that he never appreciated what you did give him. He asked me to find you and tell you that he was sorry and that he hoped you had found the happiness you deserved." Margaret listened with the grace and dignity that had characterized her entire life. Feeling sadness for the man who had let fear and disappointment poison his heart, but also gratitude for the path that his rejection had ultimately opened for her. She invited Catherine to stay for several days, sharing stories of the family she had built and the life she had created in the mountains. When Catherine prepared to leave, she pressed a small package into Margaret's hands. Inside was a daguerreotype photograph of Thomas, looking older and sadder than Margaret remembered, and a letter written in his familiar handwriting. The letter spoke of his regrets, his loneliness, and his recognition that he had lost something precious because he had been too proud and too frightened to see beyond his own disappointment. Margaret read the letter once, folded it carefully, and placed it in the box where she kept other mementos of her past. She bore Thomas no ill will, but that chapter of her life was closed. Her heart belonged to Ezra, to their children, and to the community they had built together in their mountain valley. As she entered her final years, Margaret's health began to fail, but her spirit remained as strong as ever. She continued to teach, to heal, and to love with the same passionate dedication that had marked her entire adult life. When she could no longer walk to the schoolhouse, she held classes in her living room. When her hands became too arthritic to tend wounds, she supervised younger women who had learned her techniques. On a crisp autumn morning, as the aspen trees blazed golden against the dark green pines, Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by the family she had loved so completely. Ezra held her hand as she slipped away, whispering words of love and gratitude for the woman who had transformed his life and the lives of his children. The funeral drew people from across the territory. Native American chiefs stood beside white settlers, former students beside government officials, all united in their respect and love for a woman who had touched their lives in immeasurable ways. The preacher who had married Margaret, and Ezra 30 years earlier, spoke of her as an example of how something that once seemed like a curse could be transformed into the greatest blessing. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from Emma, now Dr. Emma Thornton, who stood beside her mother's grave and spoke not of loss but of gratitude. "Our mother taught us," she said, her voice strong and clear in the mountain air, "that we are not defined by what we cannot do, but by what we choose to do with what we have been given. She showed us that love is not about blood or biology, but about choice and commitment and the daily acts of caring that build families and communities." As the years passed and Pine Ridge continued to grow and prosper, Margaret's story became part of the town's foundation, told and retold to each new generation. The house where she had lived became a landmark, eventually turned into a museum that celebrated not just her life but the values she had embodied. The school she had founded grew into a respected institution that drew students from across the West. But perhaps most importantly, the way she had lived continued to influence how the people of Pine Ridge treated those who were different, those who were struggling, those who had been cast aside by a world that often valued conformity over compassion. Because of Margaret's example, Pine Ridge became known as a place where second chances were given freely, where worth was measured by character rather than circumstances, and where love was understood to be the most powerful force for healing and transformation. The woman who had been sold for being infertile had given birth to something far more lasting than biological children. She had given birth to a legacy of love, acceptance, and hope that would continue to bless generations long after her name was carved into the weathered headstone that marked her final resting place in the Pine Ridge Cemetery, beside the man who had seen her true worth when the rest of the world had declared her worthless. Far more skla she says, dot ffargis teo sub says hirib.